And I think maybe time for a little round of thank yous. I want to thank you, UV Medicine, and the Dean, Diane Hess, and the funders to provide the space for us to be here and to share our stories and our research and our work. I work in a university, I know what pressured spaces there are, how much financial pressure they have. At the same time, we absolutely need the universities to support the arts. So I think many, many thanks. It's much appreciated. I also want to thank all of you on Zoom or in the room for lending your ears and giving your attention, which I think is also a very beautiful practice and a very nice thing to experience again. So thank you for that. So I'm going to do an academic paper, but this has quite a lot of personal undercurrents. Does it work for sound?
Yeah, great.
And it is very much work in progress, so there's a lot I'm unpacking at the moment. It is about the notion of history. I had a very sort of more academic title, which is In the Face of War, a historiographic turn in screen dance, and I thought we could just shorten that to history. Maybe because history is such a small thing. And I also want to, I have special permission to screen you a film which has only just been released in a gallery in the UK, which is 9 minutes, and I want to screen that in full. So my paper on history is going to be something like 10, 12 minutes. Piece of cake. So I'm going to read first and then screen you the film. So, my childhood and education were marked by a very deep and long shadow of World War II. I went to a high school in Germany in the 1970s and 80s. Instead of standard German textbooks, we worked with French biology, geography, and history books to learn about these subjects. The books offered a French perspective on things. It meant that as a 12-year-old, I realized that it is only a matter of perspective whether something is described as an invasion and occupation or liberation. The idea behind this cross-cultural, cross-border education was a political strategy designed to ensure that future generations would simply be Europeans and there would never, ever be another war in Europe. With the invasion in Ukraine, all of this has changed, and the hopes and dreams and collective efforts of many decades have been shattered. So Europeans find themselves backtracking, intensely speculating as to which red lines and which promises were stepped over by whom and when. There might never be a definitive answer, but there is a sense that a re-examination of history is vital to ensure a future for Europe and perhaps its survival. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to give you some images along that I'm just going to run alongside. This is a piece which is also just opened in London at the Tate Britain. You see a little bit of architecture around there. It's in Duveen Galleries. And this is a piece by Hugh Locke, a huge parade called the Procession, a huge procession of figures. And basically this is about life and death and everything in between. So I felt like a really appropriate piece. There is a standard phrase that if we don't know our history, we don't know ourselves. Stuart Hall, a Jamaican-British cultural theorist, wrote that detours through the past are necessary to make ourselves anew. An alternative phrase suggests that if we don't know our history, we don't know what we're facing. And I will examine this a bit closer. Next slide, please. In Thesis on the History of Philosophy, written in 1940, Walter Benjamin, a significant figure of the German literature, reflected on the fragile relation between past and present. He says, "Every image of the past that is not recognized by the present as one of its own concerns threatens to disappear irretrievably." Benjamin argues here that histories are dependent on the present for being recognized and written. That is, what is written or not written does not depend on the past, but on the present, on what we see. And he writes, to articulate the past historically does not mean to recognize it the way it really was. It means to seize hold of a memory as it flashes up at a moment of danger. So Benjamin describes an active process by which instances are claimed or reclaimed in some ways to disturb the idea of a continuity or a progress of history. He's very suspicious, and he's a Marxist. I should say that. He's very suspicious of the idea of progress and aligns it with a conformism that basically serves the ruling classes. He argues that every generation needs to wrestle against this conformism, which can overpower everything, even the dead. Next slide, please. Benjamin wrote this essay during the rise of fascism in Germany and Europe, witnessing firsthand the construction of a historical progression under which nothing is sacred or safe from being rewritten or misconstrued. In this stage, anything can become true, even if it was false to begin with. As Hannah Arendt, another philosopher from the same period, contends, modern totalitarianism demonstrates a strange disregard for rationality, where everything is possible. Next slide, please. In the 1940s, Benjamin issued a call to arms, so to speak. The tradition of the oppressed teaches us that the state of emergency in which we live is not the exception of the rule. We must attain a conception of history that is in keeping with this insight, that we shall clearly realize that it is our task to bring about a real state of emergency, and this will improve our position. One reason why oppressive regimes have a chance is that in the name of progress, its opponents treat it as a historical norm. Next slide. What we experience in 2022 is not that different. It is precisely that much has become normalized and is no longer considered a state of emergency. You with me?
Yeah.
Cool. Next slide, please. This is, in other words, the work of history, to challenge the process of normalization, in a nutshell. Looking at works on screen, which we are doing, I'm therefore asking, how do we screen dance history? Yes, verbs. We were talking about verbs yesterday, and I would like us to think about screen dancing history. Of course, this is not history, the history of the important men. Yeah, this is history in which anything can be a meaningful depository of historical material and tell us about the lives of the so-called ordinary people, and allow us to build micro-studies that examine and manifest the stories they hold. This is knowledge that resides within bodies as well as in movement and in the topographies that are formed through space and in time. History, therefore, does not mean something other in some distant past, but the history in her story that is alive here and now, that is the present and part of the present. It is the her story of a building that Marisa Zanotti is explored in her current work about New England House in Brighton, or the story and expressions that George Elsie showed a bit of yesterday, called Switching. Next slide, please. One might therefore argue that the past does not only flash up before us, as Benjamin contended, but that it is everywhere if we care to look. The agency is ours. In the preface to the book, Between and Past and Present, Hannah Arendt references a parable by the German-speaking novelist Franz Kafka. And you can see I'm going into a lot of German literature here, which is not a coincidence, which addresses a deep relation between the past, present, and future. So in the original parable, the main protagonist is a he. I will transpose this into a she, and I will generally use the pronoun she. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. She has two antagonists. The first presses her from behind, from the origin. The second blocks the road ahead. She gives battle to both. To be sure, the first supports her in her flight with the second, for she wants to push her forward. And in the same way, the second supports her in her fight with the first, since she drives her back. But it is only theoretically so. For it is not only the two antagonists who are there, but she herself as well. And who really knows her intentions? Her dream, though, is that sometime in an unguarded moment, and this would require a night darker than any night has ever been yet, she will jump out of the fighting line and be promoted on account of her experience in fighting to the position of umpire over her antagonists in their fight with each other. End of parable. Next slide, please. In interpreting the parable, we need to be aware that this is not representing the real life, but will tell us something about the mechanisms or the inner workings of life. So first, she is in between the two antagonists, between past and future, who each exert a force on her. The past, pressing her from behind, is curiously not a force that holds her back, as we might think, but something that pushes her forward. Conversely, the antagonist in front of her, her future, is not pulling her forward, but blocking her road and pushing her back towards the past. She then is the interruption, the disruption between the two. She is said to have a dream, that is to jump out of the fighting line and to become the umpire able to judge her antagonist from above on account of her experience in fighting. In recent discourses, this position of the outsider as judge has pretty much been deconstructed as a kind of impossibility, because there's no way of being outside of language, outside of the culture we come. We cannot jump outside. However, this is a dream, and it is probably deeply familiar to many of us and appealing. The fighting line is the her story, the reality of experience that is a constant push and pull between past and future. In this dynamic, so the parable suggests, the past is what will facilitate us moving forward, and the future will send us back. Next slide, please. No, it's perfect. So I'm going to just introduce the artist that I want to show you, the work I want to show you. This is Janan Alani. She's an Iraqi artist based in London. Her work is very much about contested landscapes, largely about the Middle East, or maybe what we should call West Asia for a change. Next slide, please. So she is very interested in artifacts, and we have in London a big museum, the Victoria and Albert Museum, which has millions of artifacts from across the world, and she was shown this particular brass tray from Iraq from 1918. Now, 1918, end of the First World War, the British army had invaded Mesopotamia over several years and pretty much occupied the land. At the end of the First World War, they drew up the boundaries of what is now Iraq, with Britain as the mandate. The dominating power. This was initially, I don't know all the details about this, I'm sketchy on this history. This was initially going to be an agreement, a promise of some collaboration, but it turned into a very nasty, violent oppression. Next slide, please. So Janan took this tray, and she was invited to do a big exhibition in a Towner gallery, which is on the south coast. This is the tray in the exhibition. Next slide. And then she was also invited. The gallery has a big collection of their own work, so she curated an exhibition in response to this tray, and then also made a film. Next slide. So in this film, you can see that's the installation space. There's a beautiful big round screen, and on the screen, on the film, we get details from the tray. So there's lots and lots of story which is being represented on this tray. You see in the middle, you might just, in the middle of the screen, you might just see a person who's being hung. This is an Iraqi person who has rebelled against the British oppression and is being killed. Next slide. Here you see in the middle, you can maybe just recognize it as the plane. The Brits clearly dominated the airspace and were a very threatening, controlling power, and there's a lot of resonances, of course, with the wars we know, be that in Iraq recently or in what's going on in Ukraine right now. Next. The guns, again, the British army with their helmets and guns pointing at the Iraqis. And at the end, the camera goes slower, closer and closer into the tray, and we find ourselves in the landscape. Could you go to the film? Sure. And while we are bringing up the film, just to say there is a voiceover of the film, which is the artist's mother, telling stories and memories that are then brought together with what is being demonstrated or represented on the tray. and the film is 9 minutes.
I've got an observation more than a question, if that's all right.
Sure.
That was fascinating and really wonderful. So much to sort of think about and unpack. But it was just my initial sort of observation, trying to sort of, or seeing connections between quite a few of the presentations and thinking around. And it strikes me, if you're this lovely idea of screen dancing, what might that be? And one element of that might be that it's about the lens that you're looking through and the importance of the specificness and almost the detail of something, how detail is important. I felt that with what Claire presented so beautifully and many other situations in Marisa, the way that the choice to focus, to exclude in a way, to exclude, and how that in the sense of what we're not seeing is helping us to see more clearly. So I find that a very kind of, just a really sort of, for me, I find that interesting. And just this notion of pushing back and pushing forward. I've been thinking a lot about iPhones recently because one of the consequences, I think, of a lot, and we've talked already about the sort of forward drive of the capitalistic kind of technology. And of course, inherent in that technology is a political and a way of seeing the world. And I think, something like an iPhone asks us almost to be so unspecific that we're almost not saying anything. So I just really appreciate that kind of idea of, that is really articulated in that film we just watched, which is the more closer, the more detail we get, the sort of, in a way, the more that might potentially be revealed to us. So I just really appreciated that.
Yeah, very nice. So many echoes with what we've discussed, and I don't know what screen dancing history might be. I just felt like an interesting way to think about it. It reminded me what you were just saying, also about what Marisa said about the sentient building. So something about if we come from an embodied state, that we understand the world in that way, and that we find a way to bring that out or in, or manifest it, connect something.
Yeah.
This wasn't one I was going to say or ask, but I'll say it anyway. So there's a.
Do you want to use the mic? Come here.
You can repeat it.
Oh.
There's a quote in by Harold Rosenberg talking about the question of, is there a Jewish art in that particular case, but similarly to your question about, is there a screen dance in history? But what he says is, if you live in a sacred world, everything glistens with meaning. And so by focusing so tightly on those images that I didn't even notice in the wider shot, that suddenly they sort of glisten with meaning. Katrina was just saying.
Yes, I'll try and repeat. So Doug just said, was referring to maybe a parallel situation where Harold Rosenberg asks about what Jewish art is, and Doug has a quote which is, if you
live in a sacred world,
everything glistens with meaning. Which is again this thing of who are we and how are we looking? It is all there to be seen possibly, or it's all our choice how we see something. And that's so wonderful in the work of Jana Nanani as well, that she uses it also, you probably know the work of Miranda Pannell. There's a very kind of similar attention and ability to really look very closely and to then reimagine what this is that you're looking at, to then create a link between the past and the present and the future. So that's a beautiful kind of discipline in some ways, maybe a beautiful practice. So Janan, for example, she made a film which I think is called Shadowlands, where she was in a helicopter going over the land, and she filmed ruins as they came were visible in the evening light through the side lighting and the shadows, you know. So just bringing out something which is there through the light, a moment of light.
There is a Zoom question. Okay. The Zoom question is, thank you, Claudia. I'm curious if you could talk about the close-ups and detailization of the landscape and how that plays a role. And that's from Wesley Lim, who presented yesterday.
Yeah, thank you. Nice question. I think it's something of what Katrina was referring to, that sometimes the more we focus, or the less is more. Also because I think it gives us more freedom to see what that maybe is. So because otherwise we think tray. Yeah. And tray sort of, oh well, we've done that one, move on to the next. We know what a tray is. You know, and to get to the stage of not knowing what you're looking at so that you can look new or fresh or differently. I think it's the power of the close-up. Yeah. And of course the storytelling from the mother does the same. It's just vignettes, you know, it's just a moment somewhere. And we, of course, we have this capacity to bring fragments together. So we just need a few fragments, and that is sort of creates this possibility of what there may have been, which I think is very interesting.
I just wanted to pick up on that actually about the voice, because I didn't find it problematic, but would have been interested to experience that without the voice and the sound effects, because in a way for me they were quite literal, and I do understand, and it was very interesting to hear. And also, and maybe this is a cultural thing, but I was so fascinated in the woman's accent, because it's actually it's a very English accent, and I thought that was a fascinating juxtaposition. And so it was both interesting, the soundtrack, but also I was also fascinated to imagine what it would have been like had we been almost allowed to go into a more abstract space sonically as well as visually.
Mm-hmm. So Katrina McPherson is asking about the voice and suggesting what would have happened if we hadn't had a voice, or the literal kind of storytelling, and also noting the accent, the English voice. Interesting question, and I mean, as you were telling us about your work with your own history and your mother, and so clearly there's also that going on here. You know, it's about her own, Janan's own story and her own bridge to her land and her past. So there is also that kind of role of the voice. Yeah. All right, thank you very much for listening.